Okay, now for most students, we would say the easier section is done. Moving on to probably the most difficult section of the paper, which is section B, which I actually find the best part of the paper because I believe it's the most skillful part of the paper where the top level students can differentiate themselves from the lower level students, but obviously with it being the most skillful, it is the most difficult. So let's have a shot at this section B. Like I always do, I'm going to go straight to the questions and then use the extracts from the question. So let's get started with this 5-mark question. So let's try to analyze this question and actually see what it's asking us. So with reference to figure 1 and the extract, so it wants us to use both these figures. That's a quite an important point. Explain one reason. So like I said in my 5-mark structure video, if you haven't checked that out, check that out. It's usually one KAA paragraph for your 5-mark question. But okay, so explain one likely reason for the change in the four firm concentration ratio in the supermarket sector between 2010 and 2015. So like I said, haven't read any of the extracts yet, but a really good practice and a really good thing I suggest to students for section B is before you even read the extracts, once you've read the question, just try to use your economics knowledge, try to use your just real world knowledge, try to tackle the question itself, and then you can use the extracts to back it up, maybe to support your argument. So here, it's asking us a reason for the change in the concentration ratio of the supermarket sector. So I'm going to start building my paragraph up straight away. So with the 5-marker, like I said, it's a KAA paragraph. My knowledge mark here is probably going to just be defining concentration ratios. I'm just going to define what a concentration ratio is, what it means. I'm maybe giving a little example. Application, like I said, application mark here is probably going to be given because it's talking about one reason for the change in the four firm concentration ratio, and it tells us to use figure 1 and extract A. So if you look at extract A, that is this, and I'm not going to read this yet, but figure 1. Yeah, so figure 1 says 2010 and 2015. It tells us the difference between the concentration ratios there and between 2015. So what I'm going to do for my application is probably just state the change in concentration ratio. So for my analysis, the command word here is explain. So I need to give one reason for the change. Now this is where I'm going to use my extracts, and of course it tells me to use figure 1 and extract A, and the only worded one there is going to be extract A. So let's have a look at extract A and see if it can give us any reason for the change in supermarkets concentration ratios. Okay, here. So the market shares of the big 4 supermarkets, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, are under pressure by shopping habits changing. So that's quite a general statement, to be fair, but it could be a reason. Many consumers are switching from one weekly shop to more frequently at local discount stores. And I understand every single person doing Edexcel Economics might not actually live in England, but if you do live in England and you are involved in the real world, you will probably know that Aldi and Lidl, they're known as like the discount supermarkets. People go there because it's cheaper, whereas Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, they sell more branded things which are a bit more expensive. So this is basically telling me consumers are switching shopping habits, and why they're switching shopping habits? Because it's cheaper. So the one reason, and my explanation, my KAA, my analysis part of my KAA is basically going to be explaining why consumers are changing from the big incumbents, so the Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, to now the local discount stores such as Aldi and Lidl. Okay, so the way I would word all of that in my analysis is, like I said, I'd reuse the words in the question. So one reason, I would have given my application, and I'll basically writing this bit out. So I would say one likely reason for the change in the four firm concentration ratio is due to consumers' shopping habits changing and consumers switching towards lower priced discount stores. Maybe a decent link here could be, you can link it to like the law of demand. So obviously if you look at a demand curve, we have price, we have quantity. As price increases, quantity demanded falls. So you can basically maybe link it to that due to discount stores, obviously they're selling at lower prices, there's more quantity demanded. But what I would say, so like I said before, consumers are switching to discount supermarkets. With consumers switching to discount supermarkets, this means the quantity demanded of the Asda, Sainsbury's, all the big supermarkets is falling, because think about it, if consumers are switching, there's less sales, there's less revenue, therefore less profits, and that is going to mean if they're generating less sales, less revenue, less profit, they have less market share. Whereas the smaller discount stores such as Lidl and Aldi, they're getting more sales, more revenue, more profit, thus their concentration ratio, which is just their market share is essentially increasing because they have more sales. Is that it mentions that these discount stores are local. So I guess you could say consumers are switching because it's more local, but Honestly, it probably will be a mark, but it doesn't really make sense if you think about the actual geography of England. Pretty much all these supermarkets are spread around everywhere. But if we just think about marks, you can probably say also they're a bit more local, and you could probably mention this bit as well, buying goods online from other grocery retailers. But yeah, that is more than enough for 5 marks. And yeah, like I said, this is how easy it is and how simple it is to break down these questions. And like you should be, like I said, this is why I always say 5 minutes is maximum for 5 markers, and you really can get these done in less than 5 minutes. As I have obviously spent this long because I'm explaining this step by step. Okay, moving on to 6B. So this is a 12-mark question. So we're getting on to a bit of the more meaty questions. So let's have a read of this. So with reference to figure 2 and extract A, so again, very nice of them to give us exact figures to look at. So when it gives you something like this, when it prompts you what to look at, I will literally just look at them too, because that's where the examiner wants you to look at, basically. But with reference to figure 2 and extract A, discuss the possible impact. So this is an impact question. So it'll come with the exam technique, but when it's asking for impacts, a lot of them should be actually in the extract. So remember, you're looking for impacts. To discuss the possible impact of the supermarket monopsony power, that's quite interesting. Supermarket monopsony power on both food suppliers and consumers. So on both food suppliers and consumers. Okay. So now, this is actually, it looks like quite a tricky question for consumers, for students. Why? Because most students learn monopsony power in terms of labour markets. So they learn it, for example, the NHS exploits doctors, exploits nurses with this monopsony power to push down wages. But also, a lot of students forget that monopsony power also exists in labour markets, but also exists in buyer markets. So this is a great example where supermarkets, since they're the sole buyer of like food, for example, food supplies, they can exploit the food suppliers. So there's food suppliers in the supermarkets. The supermarkets are the only ones that buy that food supply off the food suppliers. So a better, less tongue twister example is Network Rail. So they maintain all the railway infrastructure in England. So like the actual like tracks and stuff like that. So every single place in England, in Great Britain, is the railway tracks, the infrastructure is owned by Network Rail. This means for the actual train tracks, the suppliers of train tracks in Great Britain only have one supplier to sell to, which is Network Rail. Therefore, Network Rail exerts monopsony power, because it has power to push down the price they can pay these railway suppliers, as they are the only buyer of these like rail tracks. So they were a bit of a side note, but there's some good real world examples of monopsony power, especially in buyer markets. But yeah, back to the question. To discuss the possible impact of supermarket monopsony power on the food suppliers and then on consumers as well. So this is, so to get full marks, to get anywhere near full marks in this question, because it says and, you're going to have to mention the impacts on both suppliers and then separately on consumers. So I actually remember in extract A we were reading at the start of it. So let's look for food supplies firstly. So in extract A, I remember this part of the paragraph. It was actually talking about the effects, the monopsony power effects on food supplies. And let me just try to find where that was. So yeah, food supplies are struggling to remain in business since supermarkets are engaging in intense price wars, which of course states the relationship between the suppliers and the supermarkets themselves. So basically, if supermarkets are cutting price, the suppliers are being affected. Okay, here's a good line. It blames aggressive, so the UK's food suppliers, they're blaming aggressive price cutting by the supermarkets and delays in payment to food suppliers. Now that is a very good impact, if I was to say so myself. So aggressive price cutting by supermarkets and the delays in payments to food suppliers. So you can say one impact of the monopsony power is that because they have this power, because these food suppliers cannot sell to anyone else, they're exploiting their power by doing things like delays in payment to food suppliers. And then if you just continue reading, another impact here, so further problems include food suppliers being forced to pay excessive amounts of packaging. That's another impact. So for excessive amounts of packaging, what is that? Packaging is a cost, so it means that costs are rising for these food suppliers. And this is where like you kind of build chain of analysis. If costs are rising, and like it says here, a lot of these guys are small, medium-sized businesses. If costs are rising, what could happen? The simplest one is that they could just close down. They might be forced to shut down because there might not be enough profit in the market for them to continue. They might not be making enough sales. Or you could also say, if costs are rising, what else could happen? It means that the quality of goods being produced could decrease, because since if costs are rising, they can either continue producing the same quality and just take lower profit margins, or they could lower their quality, therefore mean that costs also lower and keep the same profit margins. So there's quite a few points there for the suppliers, and pretty much what I would do with this question, by the way, I'll probably do one KAA, because of course the 12 marker, you do a KAA, then a valuation paragraph, then you do KAA, then you do another valuation paragraph. I probably would do my first KAA on the impacts on suppliers, and then I would just do my second KAA on impacts on consumers, probably, because it sounds like the easiest way to split this. And here I'm just writing out my KAA for my first paragraph. So we went through quite a few points there. We went through, for example, costs. We went through delays in payments to food suppliers, aggressive price cutting. So you can, any of them work. As long as you build a chain of analysis around them, any of them work. I just choose to pick the one about the costs, basically. I just pick the one about they pay excessive amounts for packaging, and then we're going to relate it to costs. But for application also, so that's a bit of application I've just taken from the extract. But for application also, because the question does say, with the reference to figure 2, you could also just throw in a bit of figure 2 where, so what does figure 2 show? The proportion of food suppliers failed to meet the grocery code of conduct. So I would say, for example, Tesco has failed to meet 30% of food supplies. Yeah, whatever you want to say, just any application, any bit of figure usage, it works. So yeah, 100%. Okay, so the way I would go about this KA paragraph, so like I've written it out, so K is, so the way I'd start it, so like I said, this is going to be the impact on suppliers paragraph. The way I'd start it is just a monopsony definition, and also one little fact here, Edexcel did not actually require you to know the monopsony diagram. It would actually work quite well here. It's not needed, of course, because monopsonies is not on your spec, but it depends what time of the year you're watching this video. If it's not too close to your exams, I would actually suggest you learn the monopsony diagram, because it's quite useful, and it's really useful in like chains of analysis, for example. But if it's too close to your exams, you don't need to worry about it. But so your K, so the knowledge, I would start with just defining monopsonies. So I'd say like dominant buyer of goods in the market that use their monopsony power. They use their power as the sole buyers in the market to therefore exploit those food suppliers, knowing that food suppliers have no other choice, they have no one else to sell to, so they can use that power to exploit them. Then I would go on to say, like, but just add in a bit of application. For example, this is shown as, and then I'll just quote this, or quote a bit of figure 2 with regards to the GOC's exploitation stats. Not the GOC, I just mean this. GC or C. Then just like I was saying before, I'd pretty much say the same thing. So I'd go from my application, so forced to pay excessive amounts for packaging. Then I'd start my analysis. This means the costs for these food supplies is going to rise. If the cost for these food supplies is going to rise, this could lead to two different effects. One effect is that with costs rising, it could mean that these firms start making losses. If these firms start making losses, you can maybe introduce short run shutdown points, long run shutdown point. They may move beyond their long run shutdown point, therefore be forced outside of the market, something like that. And then I'd also say another effect is with costs rising, it can also lead to quality falling. Why? And then explain the scenario I explained previously as when firms costs rise, they have a choice. Either they maintain profit margins or they basically let their profit margins decrease. And if they let their profit margins decrease, the way they do that is by lowering quality. Therefore, it could have knock-on effects. And maybe they're say knock-on effects, and the knock-on effects ultimately would be to the consumers. But since this paragraph is focused on suppliers, I probably wouldn't mention that here, and probably would actually, it's a good point to link into your second paragraph. So let's do the paragraph on KAA, paragraph on consumers. Okay, so now just using our brains, let's try to think of some of the effects on consumers without even using the extract. So if these supermarkets are exploiting the food suppliers, so the supermarkets are getting lower prices, the supermarkets' costs are reducing, how is that going to translate onto consumers? So if you think about it, if supermarkets are paying less for their food supplies, it means that they can charge it at a lower price. This therefore means that consumers are probably being positively affected, and consumers are paying lower prices. You can link that to things like, the main thing you're going to link that to is consumer surplus as the main topic, with consumers paying lower prices. But yeah, so it probably would just be positive effects on consumers as they pay lower prices. And then the other, we could actually mention the little negative effect that we mentioned earlier. Oh, actually, before we move on to the consumer side of things, of course, we need to evaluate this, since in the 12 marker, there are 4 evaluation marks. That's why I suggest you do one at the end of your first paragraph, one at the end of your second paragraph, so you can pick up 2 evaluation marks in both. But yeah, how would we evaluate this? So we're evaluating that basically, so what we're trying to do with evaluation, we're trying to say that the supermarkets and not exploit their monopoly power, or we're trying to find a limitation basically of where they might not actually be able to exploit this monopoly power. And this again reminds me straight back to the extract, in which it talks about at the end, classic, it links really well too. So in monopolies, one of the best evaluation points you can talk about is just CMA regulation, where monopolies can't exploit their powers with exploiting consumers with high prices, since CMA will regulate them. They will stop them exploiting consumers, and that's pretty much the exact same point I'm going to give here. So it talks about GCA, which is, I'm guessing, the regulatory body for groceries, and it says here, the GCA has the power to fine supermarkets up to 1% of their annual sales if they break the groceries code of conduct. So my main evaluation point here is going to be, however, this depends on the level of GOC regulation. As if the level of GOC regulation is high, this means supermarkets will not exploit their monopoly power, as they will be scared, they will be fearful of them being fined their 1% of annual revenue. Thus meaning the negative effects on these food suppliers, like the increasing costs, shouldn't actually be felt by these food suppliers. But another really interesting thing, which I actually went through earlier, is the monopsony definition. And the pure monopsony definition is one dominant buyer or seller in the market. Whereas here, we're talking about monopsony power, but there's quite a few firms in this market. There's quite a few of these firms that are exerting this monopsony power. So you could actually just evaluate the definition saying that pure monopoly power, when we talk about monopsonies, like the NHS for example, even the NHS isn't a pure monopsony, because there's the NHS and then there's also a bit of private healthcare. But regardless, in this evaluation point, you could actually evaluate. However, this depends on the definition of monopsony power, or definition of monopsonies, as the definition of a monopsony is one dominant buyer or seller in the market. Thus, as there are lots of firms here, such as Aldi, Sainsbury's, Lidl, there are several firms here. This does not align with the perfect definition of a monopsony. And I'm going to give you way too many points here. By the way, you only need to try one of these, but I just love evaluation because it can help students pick up so many marks, and it's such a big skill you need. But another evaluation point that's just popped into my head is a standard one I used to go through for every single question. If you don't know what I mean by a standard one, watch my A-star evaluation video, most viewed video on my channel, because it's the best video I've ever made. But basically the point is time frame. So it depends on the effects between the short run and the long run. So the way I'd word this here, I'd say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the time frame. As in the long run, and I'm going to explain it now, in the long run, is this very sustainable? Is it sustainable that these firms are being exploited? They're basically just about surviving? Not really. So in the long run, if these firms are being exploited too hard, they're going to leave the market and they're going to shut down. Therefore, in the long run, supermarkets are probably going to have to pay these food suppliers a reasonable price, so they all don't end up leaving. Since if all of these food suppliers are being exploited and they leave, there's no one to supply the supermarkets with food. So that's pretty much, I'd word that into like a few lines, saying that however, this depends on the time frame, as in the long run, supermarkets will have to pay these food suppliers a reasonable price, a reasonable appropriate price, as if they don't, there'll be no supplies left in the supermarket industry, thus meaning that supermarkets cannot operate, and of course affecting their profits, revenue, sales. But yeah, like I said, you only need one of those points. Just explain it in slight detail, and that should be your 2 evaluation marks for this paragraph back. Okay, moving on to the next paragraph, which is going to be on consumers. Now, before we even look at the extract, let's just use our brains on what the effect on consumers is going to be. So essentially, we know the supermarkets are exploiting their monopoly power on these food suppliers. So the supermarkets are lowering their costs. Because what does monopoly power do? It allows these firms to lower costs because they're paying them basically an unfair price. So if supermarkets have lower costs, what does it allow supermarkets to do? It allows supermarkets to have more margin, they have more of a buffer area, so it allows supermarkets to charge consumers lower prices. And what are the effects, what are the impacts of that? If consumers are charged lower prices, it means that you can talk about several different things. Consumer welfare, consumer surplus is improved. And that's basically a paragraph in itself without even having to look at the extract. And then remember back to the last paragraph where we mentioned a bit of if the suppliers' costs are high, this could be translated to worse quality. And if quality is worsened, it will mean that obviously that is going to have an effect on the consumer, isn't it? Since if consumers' vegetables are no longer good quality, it could have effect on like health, several effects on consumers basically. So you could actually write, if you want to write a negative effect on consumers, is that with the supplies cost rising, it's going to translate to worse quality for consumers. But yeah, let's have a read of the extract just to show you this, or just try to pick up any more points. The main, because we've pretty much read through the entire extract now, the main thing that pops into my mind is just this. That's the main bit of application I would use. So the price wars, so even this, aggressive price cutting strategies. There's been several price wars between the supermarkets, and like it says, the prices paid by consumers have fallen 1.7%. Therefore, the main paragraph I would write here is just the impact on consumers, is that prices are falling, and then just explain the reasons why the prices are falling due to the monopoly power on suppliers. Therefore, it means that the supermarkets have lower costs. They can charge consumers lower prices. Also, there's heavy competition in this market. Therefore, with price wars, it means that they're undercutting each other, meaning that consumers are receiving even better prices, improving their surplus even more. Now, thinking about evaluation, lots of evaluation points here as well. This is why once you get evaluation, it's so easy. But you can use the time frame one. If you didn't use it last time, you can use it here, where we're talking about price wars. We're talking about prices dropping for consumers. But realistically, short run versus long run, how long is that going to last? In the short run, there probably are going to be quite a few price wars. But in the long run, how sustainable are those price wars? How sustainable are the constant drops in price for consumers? Since one of the main reasons that supermarkets will pursue price wars is for market share, market power. That is usually a short-term goal, whereas in the long term, supermarkets, they have shareholders. They will be more bothered about profits rather than just solely gaining market share. And an absolute classic one, one of the main ones in my A-star valuation video, I'm not just plugging in this for the sake of it, it's a very good video. But economics evaluation is all about assumptions. So we're constantly making assumptions, from ceteris paribus to this. But one assumption we made is that as these supermarkets have the monopoly power, they're going to exploit the suppliers, and therefore they have lower costs, and they're going to pass these costs on to consumers. But in reality, even though the supermarkets have lower costs, they don't need to pass it on to consumers. They could just take basically an increased profit margin. So that's a really good evaluation, saying that however, this depends on the assumption that supermarkets are going to pass on this reduced cost to consumers, and that's an absolute A-star evaluation point right there. So that is a 12-mark question done. Now, I've said lots of points there. You obviously do not need to write all of that. You just need to write your 2 KA paragraphs, your 2 evaluations, and that is it. But this is more for revision, more to get your brain fired up in that economic sense. So then if a question like this comes up, a similar question comes up, you've gone through a lot of these points and you've understood a lot of these points, and obviously it's a very good revision. So now, moving on, the 8-mark question. Now, once you've answered the 12-mark question, have a read of this. This is very, very, very simple. So, examine measures that the government, might use to restrict the monopoly power of supermarkets, which is pretty much very similar to what we've just answered, so you can really bang this out quite quickly. So one measure the government could use is regulation. So like we know, with the application as well, so a bit of application here as well, they find them 1% of their annual revenue, 1% of annual. And yeah, that is literally just structure it in a KA sense. And for the 8-mark question, you only really need 1 point. And if you want to go into depth with this point, that's completely fine. But now, just thinking about it, measures the government can use to restrict monopoly power of supermarkets. A really good thing with monopolies is actually very similar to monopolies. And what is a strategy we learn about to reduce the monopoly power in markets? So there's monopoly power. How do you define a monopoly? So a legal monopoly is a firm with more than 25% market share. A pure monopoly is a firm with 100% market share. So basically the problem in monopolies is that there's not enough firms in the market. Therefore, there's usually one dominant incumbent firm and it exploits consumers. And pretty much the same thing works in monopolies. So one way we can restrict the monopoly power of supermarkets is allow competition. Introduce competition in the supermarket industry. As if there's more firms in the supermarket industry, these food suppliers have more options to sell to. And if there's more options, if there's lots of different supermarkets, it means that the degree of monopoly power will greatly be reduced. As now, if Tesco's offering a stupidly low price, these suppliers, if you remember back to the extract actually, if you look at this, the last line, many food suppliers are reluctant to complain of fear of losing contracts with supermarkets, but this is why it works so well. But if they increase entrance, more competition in the market, it means that, like I said, if Tesco offers them a stupidly low price, they can say no to Tesco and go to one of the maybe 20 new supermarkets that will offer them a decent price. Therefore, like I said, it will reduce their monopsony power and therefore mean that, like I said, will restrict the monopsony power of supermarkets. I just want to emphasise, you only need to do one of these points, just structure it in a KAA sense, and then just write one little evaluation point, and that is more than enough for 8 marks. But it's really good, and I would 100% encourage doing this as you're practicing, you're revising with exam questions. This is exactly how it's going to be asked in the actual exam, so you can practice, just brainstorm ideas with exam questions. Yeah, you won't need 1 point for 8 marker, but if whilst you're revising, it's a really good revision activity. But yeah, third one, another point I can think of, how can the government restrict monopsony power? So the problem is that these firms, the supermarkets, are paying the suppliers, the food suppliers, too low of a price. Now, what is a strategy? What is something the government can do to stop supermarkets paying the suppliers such a low price? It's the same strategy you would use in negative externalities to stop someone buying cigarettes, for example, in negative externalities questions. And there's lots of different strategies, but one of them is minimum prices, and here that works really well as well. So if you set a minimum price, so minimum price that suppliers can pay that supermarkets can pay these food suppliers, it means that it will really restrict, it will reduce the degree to which supermarkets have this monopsony power. And of course, if you don't want minimum prices, please do make sure to draw the diagram. Why? Because it's so simple. It will literally take you about 10 seconds to draw out price, quantity, minimum price. Remember, minimum price is always above the equilibrium. Why is it above the equilibrium? Because you want to increase the price that the supermarkets want to pay suppliers. If it's below the equilibrium, it does not make sense. Okay, so just label up the points on the diagram. Nice little diagram, and straight away, by looking at this, we have 2 valuation points at the end. How could you use this diagram to evaluate now? So we've said that a minimum price will restrict the monopsony power, but then also what happens in a minimum price? What is the difference between QD and QS now? That is excess supply, which means that you could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the negative effects of the minimum price, as the minimum price will lead to excess supply by food suppliers. And what is that? Excess supply of food suppliers is wastage. Therefore, it means that there's going to be wastage of food. Therefore, it's going to be a misallocation of resources. You can even, if you really wanted to, you don't need to at all, by the way, here. It's only 2 marks of evaluation, so that would be completely fine. But just to get your brain sparking, you can link that to government failure, saying that, and that would be an example of government failure, because the government has intervened in the market trying to improve the allocation of resources, but actually led to worsened allocation of resources. And just thinking about a few more evaluation points. For regulation, very simple one. Regulatory capture depends on whether the regulators fall in, they may become fond of the firm they're regulating, therefore reduce the degree to which they actually regulate, like these firms like Tesco. With increased competition, I think a really good evaluation point would just be you could just evaluate the lack of monopsony power. It means that if now supermarkets no longer have this monopsony power, they're paying higher prices to the food suppliers, it means that supermarkets' costs are going to rise. This could lead to, and this is probably going to lead to, higher costs for consumers, therefore reduction in consumer welfare, and you can pretty much write that for any of them. But yeah, like I said, evaluation there is very simple. This 8 marker is very simple. Just make sure KA, and the biggest thing here pretty much, get it done in 8 minutes. And since the 12 marker we did before this is very similar to the 8 marker, I would even say you can get this done in like 5, 6, 7 minutes. Definitely you can save a bit of time here with the 8 mark question. Moving on to the 10 mark question, so 6D. Let's have a read of this. Assess the extent to which information gaps, which information gaps and irrational behaviour are the main causes of food waste in the UK. So the main thing I'm picking up from just reading the question, just exam technique, is that it's asking me about 2 separate things. So information gaps and irrational behaviour. So usually in a 10 mark question, you can get away with the 1 KA paragraph, but since it's asked you specifically about 2 separate aspects, I would make sure to split into 2 paragraphs. Of course, you don't need to go as detailed since you're doing 2 paragraphs, but 100% I would split it into 2 paragraphs. Now, just reading the question, the first thing I am actually going to look for is whether information gaps and irrational behaviour are actually the main causes of food waste, because it says assess the extent, so that kind of maybe tells me it's not, but it could be. And the second thing is, I usually say a lot of these section B questions, you should have enough economics theory, your economics knowledge should be good enough to just answer the question without looking at the context. But here, this is an example of a context question where you 100% need the context to pick up the marks here. Just like all of the questions, you do need the context for application, but here, I think it's quite hard to guess what the question's actually asking you here. So the question has directed us towards extract B, so let's have a read of that. So again, we're looking for the main causes of food waste in the UK and whether information gaps and irrational behaviour are the main causes of food waste. So extract B, so food waste in the supply chain. Let's have a read of this. So firstly, it says supermarkets are directly responsible for 0.2 million tonnes of food waste. So that's one of the causes, and I'm guessing that's one of the major causes of food waste. And then it told us why they end up wasting food, so expiry dates. Okay, so then it says 4.1 million tonnes of food waste occurs, and this says due to the existence of information gaps. I'm just going to quickly skip this section and then look over to the second one, because of course the question said information gaps and irrational behaviour are the two main causes of food wastage, so let's just check that. So 7 million tonnes of food are wasted. This suggests irrational behaviour. So okay, so the question, we have now established that information gaps and irrational behaviour are the two main causes, but now going back to the question, it's asking us the extent, so assess the extent to which information gaps and irrational behaviour are the main causes of food waste. Now, I've got to admit, this is actually a bit of a harder question because I would say slightly poorly worded and there's not much economics theory to back it up. So here, what you're going to have to do is just use the context as much as possible. So I'm just going to read through that paragraph again because we're assessing the extent to which, we'll start with just information gaps, our main cause of food wastage. There's not much, when you first look at it, there's not much economics theory to back that up with. But now let's have a read of the context. So we've read up until here. Now, this basically goes on to tell us how the supermarkets are looking to solve this information gap. And that is probably what I am actually going to write about. So the way I would do this is, okay, so just KA structure. So I would start with just a bit of knowledge. The knowledge would be defining information gaps. There's lots of different types of information gaps. There's asymmetrical information. For example, when you're buying a car, the seller of the car has a lot more information on the car than you as the buyer, as the seller has used the car. He knows probably ins and outs of the car, whilst you as a buyer can only judge the car and what he's presented, what he's presented to you. I define it by saying when one party in an information, so the buyer or the seller, does not have complete information to make an informed decision, therefore it leads to a misallocation of resources. Then I'll just have my topic sentence. I believe information gaps are the main cause of food wastage due to a lack of complete market information. And that is from this. The way I've got that is this line here. Basically, the supply and demand of food. So this involves improving forecasts for supply and demand of food. And what that is saying is that food is wasted due to information gaps, but due to basically that the supermarkets don't have complete market information, as they don't know how much to supply at certain seasons, as they do not know how much demand there will be. Therefore, they might oversupply, they might undersupply. Well, they will likely oversupply, thus leading to that excess supply is the food wastage. And that's basically how I would develop my chain of analysis. So just linking this sentence in the extract as much as possible to information gaps. So talking about the excess supply by supermarkets as they have a lack of market information, thus meaning that excess supply is of course food wastage. Then I would also flip it onto the consumer side. So consumers maybe demand too much food because things like they don't understand how like food labels work, they don't understand when food expires, thus they might just buy an excess amount of food as they don't fully understand the labels. A great example of this is like bread. Bread has a best before date, which might be in 3 days, but after those 3 days, you can still eat it, and there's a lot of times where the bread will be completely fine. It's just that an estimate of when the bread is in like prestige condition is in those 3-day period, but it doesn't go moldy. It's not unhealthy to eat that bread after 3 days, and that is probably, and giving something like that in an example, is what's leading to the excess demand, as individuals might just buy too much bread, as I think in this 3 days I'm only going to be able to eat this much, but then I need a new loaf of bread for those next, I don't know, 7 days. And like I said, this is definitely a bit of a harder 10-mark question since there's not much economics theory and it's a lot of just like inferences, a lot of just using the context and extracting as much as possible. And then of course your 10-mark question will have 4 marks reserved for application, so a little evaluation point at the end of this paragraph. And the one I would pick is 100% time frame, as it really is the easiest. I'll just talk about, however, in evaluation this depends on the time frame, as if we're talking about information gaps, we can say in the short run there's likely to be these information gaps, whereas in the long run, when these supermarkets over a longer period of time, when they gain more market information, where they've tried and tested different things like adjusting the supply and demand, they'll have a backlog of like statistics information which they can use, which will therefore reduce the information gap and almost solve the market failure, thus meaning there's no longer excess supply, thus solving the food wastage. So basically I'd word it something like, so however in evaluation, this depends on whether the long run can solve the market failure or the information gap. Then moving on, like I said, we're going to do 2 paragraphs here since this question split them up, and this is on irrational behaviour, and this is much easier. As whenever you think of irrational behaviour, you should think of these 3 points. So, consumers may not behave rationally. Why? Number 1, consideration of influence of other people's behaviours. So, why can this lead to food wastage? So, for example, fashion trends, maybe a big influencer's buying lots of bread, and that's the only food I can think of. Maybe one influencer buying lots of bread, and now since people are seeing this influencer buy bread, since it's a trend, they end up buying bread. But then when they take that bread home, they realise they don't actually like bread. So due to the influence of other people, due to almost like herd behaviour, they start buying bread, and this leads to food wastage. Then secondly, the importance of habitual behaviour. So consumers might be used to buying too much food. They might be used to throwing away food every single week, but since it's a habit, they keep on doing it week on week, and it's very hard to break out those habits. Then lastly, consumer weakness at computation. This basically means the lack of mental processing power a human has when making a decision. So for example, the customer might be deciding whether to buy 1 loaf of bread or 2 loaf of breads, but since it's a hard decision and they don't fully know whether they're going to eat more bread this week, less bread this week, just to be safe, they'll probably pick 2 loaf of bread, but that will very likely lead to more wastage. So any one of those factors you can build a chain of analysis around. You can even throw in 2 of them or even all of them if you'd really like, and that would be enough for the 6 marks in your 10-mark question. And just to pick up those last 2 evaluation marks, I think a really easy evaluation here is just using like your previous point, just talking about a bit about providing information. So one way you can reduce irrational behaviour is by providing information. For example, just maybe prompting individuals saying, do you really need this many loaves of bread in a supermarket? Just having like a little sign, something like that, just providing information, maybe providing an average amount of bread that each household uses, therefore it helps with individuals' decision making, therefore them less likely to buying too much bread, and therefore leading to food wastage. And that is a wrap for the 10-mark question. Moving on to the last question in section B, and the biggest question there is, the 15-mark question. So let's have a shot at this. So discuss the likely problems, so we're looking for problems, for Sainsbury's and Morrison's if the suggested merger, so we're talking about a merger between them, goes ahead. Refer to figure 1, extract C, and your own knowledge. Now, for these bigger answer questions like your 10 and your 15, I don't usually try to brainstorm too much, even though I could probably think of quite a few problems with mergers, such as monopoly power, lack of competition, diseconomies of scale, but I would use the context straight away. Why? Because the 50-mark question in the context, in the extract, they try to direct you towards a point, as they want you to speak about some certain points. So just brainstorming points here would be a bit of a waste of time. I want to see in the extract what they're trying to get me to answer about, and then I'm just going to get those points out of the extract and speak about them. So basically, the examiner wants you to speak about certain points, and they're going to be in the extract, and let's go and find them. So we're talking about extract C, so let's have a look at that. It's talking about figure 1 and extract C. We'll look at figure 1 later. Actually, we'll look at figure 1 first. So figure 1, what we look at here, so a merger, so problem between a merger between Sainsbury's and Morrison. So here we're talking about market share. Let's just identify the market share of Sainsbury's and Morrison's. That is, so, well, the main thing is that them two together, 10 plus 16, if we just round it, is 26%. How do you define a legal monopoly? A legal monopoly is a firm with more than 25% market share. So one problem is that they will become a legal monopoly now. And then, of course, like I said before, there's quite a few problems with becoming a monopoly, like exploiting consumers with higher prices. They have a lot more market power. Then it can lead to lack of competition, lack of innovation, things like that. But then now let's have a look at extract C, which you also mentioned. So proposed merger activity in the supermarket sector. Let's see if there's anything valuable here. So they've recommended a merger. They claim it would lead to, they claim it would lead to increased economies of scale. But remember, what was the question asking for? The question was asking for problems, but that looks like it's quite a good evaluation point because the extract states it. Market power for business, such merger. Okay, so this basically talks about regulation and how it's likely to go ahead these days. So the second paragraph is about the challenges, which is basically problems. So they should actually give us something to answer the question with. So there's considerable overlap between the locations. So that can lead to like wastage, inefficiencies, like diseconomy of scale, you could even say. Then a large company would require rationalization and coordination of 100,000 employees. Yep, so like lack of efficiency, diseconomy of scale. So a new expensive IT system is likely to be required. And the underlying difficult market trends would remain in the food retailing industry. that last point is very interesting. Why? Because if we think chronologically back, what was the main theme of this context? It was talking about how basically Aldi and Lidl, the discount supermarkets, are basically taking over. They're taking market share, and these the larger ones like Morrison's, Asda, Sainsbury's, they are losing market share. So here we're talking about a merger between Sainsbury's and Morrison's, but that's not going to stop the apparent fact that these two supermarkets are losing market share anyway to the new Aldi and Lidl, to the discounter stores. So I'm just going to give you a few points here you can write about. I'm not going to write the full chain of analysis out, but like I said, one point there is definitely this one. So underlying market trends. So Aldi and Lidl are still taking over, and the main thing is a merger does not solve this. A merger will not help these two firms. Yes, they will join together, but slowly by slowly, year after year, Aldi and Lidl, these discount stores, will be taking more market share. And you can develop a nice chain of analysis around that. A really good evaluation point I was thinking here is you could say, however, this depends on a firm's objectives. As with the new, because if Sainsbury's and Morrison merge, they have more market power, and with this new market power, they could pursue a different objective. Like, for example, they could pursue sales maximizing, therefore reducing their prices. So they could basically match Aldi and Lidl's prices. Therefore, in the long run, and with different business objectives, they could actually compete with Aldi and Lidl in the long run, and with different business objectives. And another great point, and this would probably be my main point for a paragraph, 27.4% market share when they merge. So this means it's a legal monopoly. And in this paragraph, I would probably talk about what is a problem with Sainsbury's and Morrison's becoming a legal monopoly. There's several problems like exploiting consumers. So of course, with that monopoly power, since they have so much of that market share, they can charge a higher price, and consumers, maybe they have a degree of inelastic demand, therefore forced to buy it, and then lack of innovation. The reason they may have a lack of innovation is due to their high market share, due to their already very high profits. There's no incentive for them to reinvest. There's no incentive for them to become dynamically efficient, invest into research and development. Therefore, in the long run, this can lead to many negative effects like consumers' the quality of goods being worse. Then, of course, it did mention here where there's basically going to be problems with, if we think about it, there's Morrison's and Sainsbury's. They usually, a lot of these supermarkets are quite close. There's two supermarkets in a 1 minute walking distance is quite a big waste, isn't it? And then merging the stores together, merging the employees together, etc, etc. But if I was writing this paragraph point on them becoming a legal monopoly, a really easy evaluation here is, I could actually relate a bit more to the extract as well, is about regulation. So it talks about GCA regulation somewhere, so whatever it's called, the groceries, it's in one of these extracts. GCA, the Groceries Code Adjudicator, or any regulatory body. Basically, if my evaluation point would be, however, in evaluation, this depends on the level of GCA regulation, as if the level of regulation is high, it will mean that even after the merger, Sainsbury's and Morrison's will not be able to exploit consumers with high prices. They may be forced to reinvest into research and development. Therefore, it will stop the negative effects of them becoming a legal monopoly. Another point, of course, from the extract would be just this point regarding to the locations of stores, enlarged company, hundreds of thousands of employees. So basically, if you think about it, there's lots of Sainsbury's and Morrison's very close together, like maybe a minute walk from each other. If they merged, it would be very inefficient to keep them both open. So it would lead to massive diseconomy of scale, especially with employees having like a new work culture, etc, etc. So this would be a massive problem for the firm. So you could definitely write a paragraph on diseconomies of scale. And then, like I was saying earlier, a really easy evaluation point, if you're going to write a diseconomy of scale paragraph, would literally be the extract. So it basically talks about diseconomy of scale here, but then in the first paragraph, it talks about increased economies of scale due to more market power, etc, etc. So you could say, in fact, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of economies of scale, as due to, for example, purchasing economies of scale, since they have more market power, since they're buying larger quantities, they can negotiate lower prices, and with lower prices, it reduces their LRAC, and that would, of course, be an example of economies of scale. And then the last point you could also speak about, literally it just reminded me looking at the questions, which is this question we answered earlier, which is restricting the monopsony power of supermarkets. Now, we talked about monopoly power and that they're going to become a legal monopoly, but also their monopsony power. So these supermarkets already have this massive degree of monopsony power, but now with these supermarkets merging, it's going to further expedite, it's going to further increase that monopsony power, therefore food supply is being further exploited, and that's obviously a massive problem of the merger. then if you want to evaluate that Monopsony PowerPoint, you can literally use one of the points used in the Monopsony 6C, so one of the points used here, since evaluation still works. But yeah, that's loads of points I've just given you for that 15-mark question. Of course, to get 15 marks, you do not need to use all these points. Just pick 2 KA paragraphs, so 2 problems, and then 2 evaluations, and that should be enough for 15 out of 15 if you write in enough detail.